Welcome to spooky season. We have some delightfully horrific new additions to our Overdrive comic book collection. First, when it comes to horror comics, Precode is a secret password for the really good stuff. So, what does Precode even mean anyway? Well, the unfounded belief that reading horror comics causes juvenile delinquency created a widespread moral panic in the 1950s. Many cities even began burning and banning these types of comics, and there were televised Senate hearings about this now debunked connection between comic books and criminal behavior. At the time, rather than succumbing to government regulations, the Comics Magazine Association of America established a code of ethics and standards similar to the Hays Code adopted for the film industry in 1940. Among all of the requirements of this new code, and no comic could use the words horror or terror in their title, and all scenes of horror, gruesome illustrations, and scenes dealing with the Walking Dead, vampires, and werewolfism were prohibited. You know, the good stuff. So here's just a small sample of some of the pre-code horror titles. And more of them. And more of them. And more of them. And there's even more on Overdrive. Before the Comics Code, over 1,400 titles, nearly a quarter of all comic books were horror titles. Unfortunately, very few pre-code horror comics survived the transition, since the Comics Code didn't leave a lot of options for their approved horror stories. It wasn't even until an update in the 70s that horror staples like vampires and werewolves could be used again. Most pre-code horror titles simply faded away. That said, pre-code horror comics had an afterlife of sorts through publishers like Eerie and Skywald. They eschewed the code and put out black and white comics magazines that were a mix of old horror stories that they updated with even more gruesome art and rounded them out with new material. Their covers were an eye-catching mix of lurid details, electric colors, and provocative titles. You probably can't think of horror without thinking of the classic monsters, and most likely you picture them as they appeared in Universal Studios movies. So, of course, it's easy to find the comic book versions of these famous monsters. But those movies came out in the 30s and 40s, so let's give them an update. But some updates are weirder than others. Now that we know where to find the good stuff and the classics, let's not leave out the kids. Good little witches, friendly or timid ghosts, even little devils make for a fun, spooky season without being too scary. Of course, we've added more than comics to thrill you. There's also dozens of collections of classic monster magazines, covering everything from the earliest horror movies to the then modern films of when they were originally published in the 60s and 70s. So, where can you read them? On Atlanta, Texas Public Library's Overdrive ebook collection, featuring over 100 volumes of Guandanaland Comics, horror, and monster magazine collections, with more being added all the time. Spooky reading!